The day my body was washed up on the beach, my fiancé, a forensic pathologist, was making out with his first love by the sea. He jokingly nudged me away with his shoe. Hey, if karma is real, do you think the guy who murdered my father will end up like this too? I looked at the damaged police badge on my corpse, a tear of self-pity trickling down my cheek. No, he won't. I already died with the truth, brutally killed by the culprit. Now, she not only walks free, but is frolicking with a victim's family member by the sea. As night fell and the tide came in, my body was dragged by the waves, colliding with the rocks. My face was disfigured, flesh torn and decomposing, my chest and abdomen swollen. Even I found it grotesque. Wendy drifted next to me, shaking her head at my corpse. What kind of grudge did you have? So many stab wounds. You look like a fishing net. I glanced at the shimmering sea under the moonlight, and over at the couple intimately close not far away. A bitter smile on my lips. No grudge. Just trying to help my boyfriend resolve his issues and ended up dead. He must have loved you a lot to make you risk your life, Wendy, a young girl with sea-soaked, eerie green eyes, said with a faint longing in her gaze. I smirked sarcastically, pointing at the pair entwining on the bridge. He's right there. Jimmy whispered something to Sue that made her smile. The evening breeze tousled her hair, and Jimmy gently brushed it back, his hand slipping around her slender waist. They kissed passionately under the dim streetlight. If they just turned their heads, they'd see my bloated body lifeless in the waves. But alas, their eyes were only for each other. They never noticed anyone else from the beginning. Wendy was silent for a moment, then lightly patted my head with her wet hand. Sister, it's okay. Only those who drown have their souls trapped in the water. Lure them here, I'll drag them to hell for you. I shook my head slightly, refusing her offer. From the first day my soul floated in the sea, I knew Wendy's way of finding living substitutes was a terrible sin. Moreover, Sue killed my unborn child. A filthy-hearted woman like her doesn't deserve to rot in the same sea as me. Shortly after my death, I tried to visit Jimmy to see him one last time. He was sitting in his car, carefully adjusting his Windsor knot tie in the rearview mirror. The dark red stripes looked familiar, and his long fingers moved from his neck to his Adam's apple. Messages kept popping up on his phone. He seemed uneasy, his usually composed eyes now restless. I followed him to a lively, noisy room. As he entered, the conversation ceased, everyone's gaze turning to a tipsy, pretty woman on the sofa. She reached out to Jimmy. Jimmy. He walked up, taking the wine glass from her hand and setting it on the table, his response barely audible. Dim lighting blurred his profile, making it hard to discern, except for the way he looked at her. His gaze seemed to cut through time, detached yet hiding a deep tenderness. Stop drinking, you get rashes. For a moment, I stood there, heart aching, realizing that after all these years, he hadn't forgotten her. Sue was Jimmy's first love from his youth. Their breakup had been messy. To pay off her father's massive debt, she dropped out of college and married an older, wealthy businessman abroad. Jimmy and I traveled in similar circles. Any information he got, I'd eventually hear too. Rich folks often have some perverted quirks. Sue had a rough life in recent years. Half a month ago, word spread that she was returning, and it was clear Jimmy's mood had changed. He often sat alone on the balcony smoking. Only when the cigarette burnt down to his fingers did he snap out of his daze. Many nights, I'd wake up to find the bed cold, seeing him sitting alone in the living room, fingers typing on his laptop, looking lonely and lost. People say a woman's intuition is sharp. I immediately linked his change in behavior to Sue's return. This led to the worst argument we ever had. Trying to grab his phone, he smashed it on the floor, screen shattering. Cindy, I'm done with her. Why are you so paranoid? Paranoid? Was I really paranoid? That night, staring at the broken phone, tears wouldn't stop. Do you still love her? Jimmy stayed silent for a bit. Her dad ran over and killed my dad. There's a death between us. We'll never be together. He repeated the last sentence twice, maybe to convince me or himself. He came and hugged me, his warm hand soothing my back. We're about to get married, right? Don't let baseless things ruin us. At that time, I still didn't realize the deeper meaning behind his words. I was slowly getting lost in his rarely exhibited tenderness and patience. So lost that to help him let go of a decade-old grudge, I lost my life. The room was lively. Sue got up saying she needed to sober up and left. Shortly after, Jimmy followed. Everyone wore a knowing look. Amid their murmuring, I heard my name mentioned. A tipsy Sue wobbled, leaning against the pearly white wall, her fragile shoulders drooping. Her sobs echoed down the empty hallway. Jimmy stood behind her, hands in his pockets, just an arm's length away. His brows were sharp like a knife, and his dark eyes were cold and emotionless. Why are you crying? I'm the one who lost a loved one, right? His voice was low, laced with a faint trace of irony. yet there was a subtle hint of care that was hard to detect. Sue turned around, startled, her eyes lingering on his face. When she noticed the tie around his neck, tears streamed down her cheeks. Jimmy froze, his thin lips parted slightly, but his harsh words were swallowed by her lips as she kissed him. The scene before me was too shocking. My chest felt like it was being torn apart by a knife, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I shouted loudly, "Push her away, Jimmy, push her away. You promised me you wouldn't get entangled with her again. You promised me." The colorful lights from the hallway ceiling shone brightly on them, casting an ambiguous and intimate atmosphere. Nobody paid attention to my cries. I could only watch as Sue held onto his waist, standing on her toes to kiss his lips repeatedly. Jimmy went from being stunned to holding her head, deepening the kiss with fierce intensity, a blend of revenge and possessive invasion. I curled up into a ball, my heart clenching in pain. The betrayal hurt far more than the physical pain of a knife wound. "Jimmy, I'm sorry. We've been living in guilt every day. I'm willing to spend my next life repaying for his sins." Sue's cheeks were flushed, her eyes misty as she curled up in his arms, pleading, "You still have the tie I gave you, which means you can't forget me, right?" He pressed a hot kiss to her ear, his words biting from between his teeth. "Forget. I wish I could take revenge on you day and night." Such errant emotions, Jimmy had never shown to me. With me, he was always restrained and composed. Even in our most intimate moments, he maintained a reserved and abstinent demeanor, as if I was the only one deeply involved. "Jimmy, please don't marry Cindy just to get back at me, okay?" Sue interrupted my thoughts, leaning against his chest, sipping softly. Hearing my name suddenly, Jimmy froze for a moment, as if he finally remembered my existence, remembered he had a girlfriend. He let go of Sue, stepping back. He returned to that familiar, cold and solemn demeanor. He stayed silent for a while, lowering his eyes, his expression unreadable. I laughed mockingly, tears filling my eyes again. Staring up at the bright-colored lights, I covered my eyes with trembling hands, but tears still seeped through my fingers. Years ago, Sue's father killed several pedestrians in a hit-and-run accident while driving drunk. One of the victims was Jimmy's father, who was on his way home from work. Jimmy's mother fell seriously ill because of it and passed away not long after. At that time, Jimmy had just entered college. The loss of both parents was a heavy blow to a young man. Meanwhile, Sue was quickly sent abroad by her family, married, and settled overseas. During those years, Jimmy's pride was stripped away, and he lived cautiously. I was the one who stood by him through it all. We lived in the worst basement, splitting a $5 bowl of street wontons. Over the years, I stood by him as he rose from obscurity to becoming a renowned forensic doctor. We moved into a new house and were preparing to get married. Did Sue think a simple word of revenge could erase all that Jimmy and I had? I wanted to argue, to refute it, but Jimmy's silent acceptance broke my heart. We'd spent countless nights together in each other's arms. Out of all those kisses, was there ever one with genuine love? Was there ever a hug meant for spending the rest of our lives together? Looking back now, he promised me marriage, to start a family with me. Yet he never said he would love me. Perhaps it's because Sue was there when his love was pure and strong. No matter how hard I tried later on, that spot in his heart would remain irreplaceable. The protective spikes I had were stripped away, leaving only blooded scars. Jimmy, he never loved me from the start. The two walked back to the private room one after the other. This class reunion, arranged specially for Sue, was nearing its end. As the gathering broke up, a close friend of Jimmy's asked about my absence, wondering if I was busy with wedding preparations. Sue turned her face slightly, and our eyes met. "She's out of town on a case," Jimmy answered perfunctorily, avoiding any mention of the wedding. He didn't know yet. I was already dead, killed by the hands of his first love's father. At that moment, I suddenly looked forward to him seeing my body. He was a forensic doctor, accustomed to life and death, and deeply superstitious. He once told me that the greatest fear in a forensic career was encountering a corpse with the giant's view. And after dying for him, the waves happened to carry my body into his jurisdiction. Before he could confirm my identity, he had to personally perform the autopsy. He would understand precisely what tortures I endured before death, but he wouldn't know all those terrible things were gifted to me by the one he cherished so dearly. As he handled my corpse, he would be overwhelmed by frustration. There'd be a raw, unmasked aversion, and he might even complain to his colleagues. But soon enough, the autopsy reports would confirm that the body was mine. Perhaps the police would even uncover the fact that it was for him that I suffered such a fate at the hands of his first love. Meanwhile, he had just embraced his father's killer and publicly desecrated my corpse. Perhaps my prayers worked. Sue suggested they head to the beach to sober up. I floated silently above, watching them bask in their past love, reminiscing their youthful days by the sea breeze. Sue walked to the water's edge, picking up pebbles and skipping them across the surface. The night was dim, the sky painted with thick darkness, not even a star in sight. My body lay hidden in that impenetrable blackness, silently accompanying them. Jimmy was worried it was too dark at night. He didn't want her shoes and socks to get dirty. He gently coaxed her back to shore. His tone was indescribably gentle and calm. Sue was standing closer to my body. She seemed to catch a whiff of the faint smell of decay in the air. It smells awful. The sea often had dead fish and shrimp. Nearby villagers liked to throw dead cats and dogs into the sea. There must have been a lot of lost souls gathered there. Terrified, she ran ashore, pale-faced. She jumped into the man's arms, playfully hitting his chest with her fists. Jimmy chuckled, saying, "You're so scared. If it was Cindy, she'd probably drag me to study how long they've been dead." Sue froze, looking up dumbfounded. Jimmy, surprised, had uttered the name he had been trying to ignore all night without realizing it. His mood changed instantly, feeling off. Sue, ever so attentive, sensed his discomfort and brought me up. "Where's Cindy? I haven't seen her in a while. Won't she be upset that I'm back?" Jimmy softened his expression, frowning slightly as he said, "No, you two are best friends, aren't you?" Sue laughed bitterly. "Best friends? And she wants to take the person I love most." There was a moment of silence, and her face gradually darkened in Jimmy's silence. She leaned into Jimmy, her elegant jawline resting lazily on his shoulder, slowly sliding, her movements fluid and intimate. Just then, a wave came, and my body floated with the tide, my hair brushing Sue's sandaled ankle. Unaware, she snuggled closer to Jimmy. The waves continued, and my cold, rigid shoulder bumped into her round toes. Sue instinctively stepped back. With her movement, Jimmy stumbled because of me. Under the bright moonlight, my disfigured face was illuminated. It was exactly as I had imagined. Jimmy's brow furrowed and his face looked grim when he saw the corpse. My body had swollen significantly, and my skull was left with sparse hair. The facial muscles had decayed long ago, showing signs of marine life's visits. This face was so far gone even I couldn't recognize it. Jimmy forced a smile, trying to stay composed in front of Sue. Disdainfully, he used the tip of his shoe to nudge me away, joking, "Do you think if good and evil were really repaid, my father's killer would die as horribly as this?" A tear of self-mockery rolled down from the corner of my eye, staring at the broken police badge on me. No, it wouldn't happen. I was brutally murdered by the killer, carrying the truth with me. While she remained safe and sound, she was there, entwined with the victim's family by the sea. Sue backed away, horrified and nauseating. Jimmy dialed the phone, and my body was soon taken to the forensic vehicle. Jimmy finally turned to take care of the pale, dazed Sue. He took off his white gloves, and, just as his hand was about to touch her back, she dodged. The look of disgust and contempt flashed quickly in her eyes, but Jimmy noticed it instantly. He stared in shock at his empty palm, lips tightly pressed, the sunlight casting a silhouette over his lashes as his eyes lowered, as if he remembered something suddenly. Without much of an expression, he kept rubbing the callus on his index finger with his thumb. It was a habit of his when he was distressed. "This place isn't for you," he said coldly, leaving Sue behind as he turned to leave. I sat in the passenger seat, watching him light a cigarette, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the ashy surface. He once mentioned that many forensic scientists pick up smoking, not out of habit, but because the sight smell was too overwhelming. Smoke helps diminish the stench of decomposing corpses. Jimmy smoked several cigarettes in a row, even after the putrid smell had long gone from the car. His fingers still fiddled with the cigarette butts. Finally, he irritably turned on his phone, a strange emotion flickering in his eyes as deep as the night. I leaned in, just in time to see him open our chat history. Interesting, after feeling rejected by his first love, he remembered me. How ironic. The latest message I had sent him was from 7 days ago. I forwarded some sample wedding photos from a studio, asking for his opinion. All he replied with were 2 dismissive words. "Up to you," casually, not caring at all. I was sure he didn't even open the link. 7 days ago, I told him I was going on a business trip. He was probably too busy, or maybe he just didn't care. He didn't text me on Instagram once in that period. As I was lost in thought, Jimmy opened the link and sent an Instagram message. The first set, "The red looks good on you." He stared at the screen for a long time, his hand hovering, unsure of where to tap. He didn't get a reply. He stubbed out his cigarette, crumpling the filter, then glanced at the screen one last time, before tossing his phone onto the dashboard in frustration. His body slumped back against the seat, his elbow resting on his face, letting out a deep sigh, trying to cover up his anxiety and unease. My body was pushed into the autopsy room. The examination was challenging, taking Jimmy a lot of time. By the time he collected my heart blood and exited the autopsy room, it was midnight. Sue was waiting at the door, her features gentle, her demeanor calm. She had reverted to the highborn girl she once was. Jimmy handed the sample to his assistant for DNA testing, then stood in the corridor chatting with Sue. Noticing Sue's distaste for forensic work, Jimmy grew colder towards her. Maybe he was thinking about me, thinking about the fiancé who neither minded his stench of death nor his hectic days, always putting in effort alone. Perhaps because I always considered him too much, he never valued my efforts. I was jolted back as Jimmy's assistant stumbled out, her eyes wide, voice choked, unable to complete a sentence. Jimmy sounded indifferent. If the database can't find the deceased's information, let the criminal investigation team handle it. It found it. We triple-checked. The result is the same every time. That body belongs to Cindy, your fiancé. Jimmy froze. He turned, staring at my body for a long time, before inexplicably laughing out loud. Ridiculous. Cindy is out of state. Curse her again, and I'm docking your pay. The assistant choked up a bit, his facial muscles stiffened. He opened his mouth, but couldn't call out my name. Jimmy had a frozen smile on his face for a long while, his voice trembling as he spoke again. It can't be her. You acted really well. It can't be her. The assistant, hands shaking, shoved the report into Jimmy's arms. According to the records, the samples on the glass plate matched my data in the database. Jimmy's face gradually changed. I saw his expression slowly turn rigid. When he looked up again, the color drained from his face, leaving it deathly pale. This can't be possible. It's not possible. Something must be wrong. I'll resample. He staggered into the autopsy room, his tall frame slightly hunched, but he stopped short, not far from my body. As a forensic scientist, he knew better than anyone that scientific results don't lie. Jimmy slowly walked to the corpse. The body had swollen several times its original size due to the buildup of gases, almost not fitting on the once spacious autopsy table. He squatted down slowly, as if rooted to the spot. His eyes trembled violently with emotion, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Why did it have to be like this? Why? His voice was choked, sour, and unpleasant, unlike his usually steady tone. Weren't we supposed to take wedding photos? Cindy, we were getting married. Jimmy, the dead can't come back. Sue squatted down, comforting him softly, though the sadness on her face looked fake. I had studied micro-expressions in psychology. Her current sadness didn't reach her eyes. Instead, the corners of her mouth slightly lifted. She wasn't surprised by my death. In fact, she seemed to have known about it all along. In an instant, a bold thought shocked me to the core. Sue knew I was killed by her father. I tried to recall all the signs before my death, searching for any overlooked clues. My head felt like it had been hammered, making my scalp tingle and my vision dizzy. I placed a hand on the back of my head, and snippets of memory flooded in. A week ago, I took leave from the office, using up my accumulated vacation time. When I went home to pack, I saw Jimmy on the balcony, playing with the cat while replying to something on Instagram. I told him I was going on a business trip to a neighboring city, and would bring him some good news when I returned. Jimmy was taken aback, and, in an unusually pleading tone, asked, "Does it have to be this week?" Every year around this time, he would get very down, because it was near the anniversary of his father's death. Usually, I was the one with him, handling all the preparations for the memorial. This year, I wanted to help him move past this long-standing sorrow, so I planned to be away. I nodded, continued packing, but noticed that my clothes had white cat hair on them. The rash on my arm was showing signs of coming back. I took some allergy medicine from the drawer and turned to discuss the cat's future with Jimmy, but he was already looking down, gently petting the cat, with a smile much more vivid than the one he had for me. Noticing my gaze, he simply replied, "Be safe." Words of concern for him died in my mouth. Forget it, as long as he's happy. I thought this trip would be fruitful, but the tip from my informant was already uncovered by Simon. By the time I arrived at Simon's hideout, he was long gone, and the place had been completely cleaned up. I stomped my feet in frustration. Every time, I was only a step away. It was as if Simon had a tracker on me, always slipping away, just when I was about to catch him. The frustration weighed heavily on my chest, suffocating me. I couldn't bring Jimmy the good news I promised, and I felt guilty. On my way back, the informant gave me new information. She directed me to Sue's former villa. It had been abandoned for years. As the home of a murderer, few people wanted it, even after it was seized and auctioned by the court, and it became a wasteland. Weeds overgrew the yard, but there was a path trampled through them, leading straight to the basement door. Years ago, Sue had shown Jimmy and me this basement. It was spacious and silent, used by wealthy families as a shelter in case of disasters. Sue proudly told us that, with enough supplies, one could live there for a year or more. I became wary, squeezed through the half-height entrance. I wasn't surprised to find signs of life inside, and the very much alive Simon, who was supposed to be rotting in prison. He was just as surprised to see me, falling to his knees and begging me not to turn him in. Catching him had become my mission, ingrained in my blood. No way I would let him go. When Simon realized pleading was in vain, he tried to fight back. I was the best in the squad at hand-to-hand combat, and his years of hiding had weakened him. It didn't take me much effort to subdue him. He started cursing me with the vilest words. "You wretched woman, chasing me all these years. Jimmy doesn't even care anymore, but you won't let it go. Did I kill your father? Think being a cop makes you special. You're just picking up my daughter's leftovers." I pinned him against the wall, his arm twisted behind his back. "Simon, you have 3 lives on your conscience. If you're still a man, think about your wife and daughter." My unfinished words were cut off by a loud noise. The sound of a metal rod hitting bone echoed in my ears, pain searing from the back of my head through my body, plunging me into darkness. Freed from my grip, Simon said something. I couldn't make it out, deafened by the ringing in my ears. Someone responded to him. A young woman's voice. The pain consuming my body demanded all my attention, soon followed by more stabbing agony in my waist, chest, and back. It was the biting, cold sharpness of a blade sinking into me. I didn't even have time to cry out in pain. My throat was slit, and the bitter taste of blood filled my mouth. Until I lost consciousness, I endured the most excruciating pain. Thinking back now, the person who ambushed me from behind could only have been Sue. She might have been involved in the entire plot to kill me. News of my death spread quickly. The first people to arrive were my colleagues from the police station. Leading them was my master, a seasoned cop who spoke little, but was very thorough in his work. I learned most of my skills from him. To me, he was both a mentor and family. Master's face was grim, his expression colder than I had ever seen. When he saw Sue standing next to Jimmy, his eyes paused, full of sarcasm and disdain. He was the one who handled Simon's drunken hit-and-run case back in the day. He knew our relationships better than anyone. "Cindy hasn't contacted you all these days, and you didn't find it odd?" Jimmy buried his face in his hands. The veins in his exposed arms bulged, as if he was trying hard to suppress his emotions on the brink of collapse. "She said she was on a business trip. I didn't think." Master's lips turned pale, and the stubble on his temples trembled with anger as he shouted, "Business trip, my ass. She took extended leave. As her fiancé, you didn't know where she was but had the energy to entangle with your ex-girlfriend. Do you think that's fair to her?" Jimmy looked dazed. After being yelled at, he finally noticed Sue's hand still on his arm, and they were standing very close. He jolted upright, shaking off Sue's touch. His movements were frantic, his eyes filled with red veins, looking terrifying. I had never seen Jimmy like this. He seemed like a beast trapped in a snare, full of defeat. In that moment, I thought, maybe he did like me a little. The sadness on his face was real. My death affected him more than I had imagined. Master's expression hardened. "Do you have her parents' contact info? Do you know who Cindy interacted with before she died?" The killer was ruthless, each stab deadly. It was clearly personal. She probably knew the killer. Jimmy stood there, dumbfounded. Despite being almost 6'3", he hunched over suddenly. His lips moved, but no useful words came out. I don't know. I stood next to him, looking at his suddenly aged face, and thought to myself, of course you don't know. It was always me who tried to get into his life, understanding what he liked and didn't like, accommodating his lifestyle. The loved one is always confident, while the one who loves walks on eggshells. He always remembered that Sue got rashes from drinking, but didn't know I was allergic to cat hair. Or maybe he did, but he didn't care, and chose to ignore my feelings. The cat he adopted home was actually the one he had adopted with Sue back then. He lied and told me he found it by the roadside. I actually always knew, but I never exposed the lie. I feared that if I made him choose between me and the cat, he would choose the cat. Jimmy treasured his memories with her, but he couldn't spare a bit of care for me. My passion was exhausted, leaving only fatigue and indifference. At this moment, I didn't even have the strength to cry. I was exhausted. I just wanted to leave here quickly, find a place to hide. After 7 days, the lingering spirits would be taken away. These rules of the ghost world were taught to me by a ghost friend, Wendy. Being with ghosts is sometimes freer than being with people. But I couldn't leave in the end, because Master found my family's contact information, and informed them of my death. They were the closest people to me. I had to see them one last time to have no regrets. My parents arrived quickly. I heard my mom's crying even before I saw them. The sound was unusually clear in the silent hallway. The staff took them to the morgue. The body has been soaked in seawater for a long time. The face is severely damaged. Be mentally prepared. My mom's hurried footsteps stopped at the door of the morgue. She held onto the door frame, hesitating. My dad was braver, but he didn't go in either. Instead, he turned and asked, "Can the body still be used?" The staff frowned, not understanding, but I instantly got his meaning. My growth wasn't perfect. Years ago, after a huge falling out with my family, my parents once said they wished to never see me again. Half a month ago, they started desperately trying to contact me, asking me to come home, because my sister missed me. That act had been played countless times over the past 20 years. I knew what they were hiding, but I didn't believe they'd be so ruthless. I didn't believe that when they heard of my death, they wouldn't be sad. Now, disappointment overwhelmed me like a flood. I covered my ears, curled up in a corner, not wanting to hear another unkind word from them. But my father's meticulous voice slipped through my fingers. "My younger daughter has leukemia. She needs a bone marrow transplant. Can we use the body? If we can draw what we need, we'll take the body away. If not, dispose of it as you see fit." They didn't say the last few words, but the meaning was clear. Suddenly, I felt grateful that Simon had thrown my body into the sea. Otherwise, I would have been their daughter's blood bank even in death. Bang! The glass window in the corridor suddenly shattered with a loud noise. I looked up, shocked to see Jimmy grabbing my dad by the collar, pressing him hard against the window. The bloodthirsty look in his eyes was terrifying. My mom screamed, rushing over to pull at his sleeve. "You bring disaster. Killing your parents wasn't enough. Now you've caused my daughter's death. What do you want? Are you trying to kill someone else? If Cindy hadn't been with you, she wouldn't be lying in there. You didn't investigate your father's death, but made her a cop to solve your case. You should have been the one to die." The staff quickly moved in to separate them, but Jimmy seemed to lose all his strength and collapsed onto the cold floor in disarray. My body was taken to be cremated and ended up as a small handful stored in a black wooden box. Jimmy took the box home. This was my first time back after my death. Although I expected it, my heart still ached when I opened the door and saw Sue inside. She was playing with a kitten, and there were a few dresses in the room that didn't belong to me. So, in my absence, she had already confidently started acting as the mistress of the house. When Jimmy returned with the urn, Sue's expression changed several times. "Are you going to put that thing in the room?" Jimmy's sharp gaze scanned over her, his eyebrows tight, and his tone extremely cold. "This is Cindy's home. I brought her back. Any problem with that?" Sue's body stiffened noticeably, perhaps not expecting him to speak to her so coldly. Tears instantly welled up, and she began to sob in grievance. Gentle persuasion had always been her weapon, but today, Jimmy was not only indifferent, but also impatient. "Finish crying, pack your things, and leave. Don't let me see you again." Sue stood baffled and pale, tears hanging precariously on her lashes, seemingly unable to believe he wanted to cut ties with her. "Jimmy, you don't want me anymore." Jimmy's voice was icy, and he looked at her as if she were a stranger. "Sue, we broke up 7 years ago. After your dad killed my dad and fled, there was no way we could be together. When you left me, did you ever think about the kind of life I would have?" Jimmy's face was mournful, and he hugged the urn tighter, his eyes filled with regret and sorrow. "Those years, if it weren't for Cindy, I wouldn't even know where I'd have ended up. If she hadn't stayed with me and supported me, the Jimmy standing in front of you now would be a useless piece of trash. You and I were never the same from the start. It's my fault for not recognizing before, ignoring Cindy, and clinging to those past, meaningless feelings. Now, karma's taken Cindy from me, and it's my punishment." His voice choked, and his fingers trembled as he held the urn. His eyes turned red, and tears started to fall onto the lid. Sue's face turned pale with fear by his decisive words, and her eyes flashed with unwillingness and jealousy. "She's already dead, and I'm the one standing alive in front of you." You, Jimmy, like a beast struck in a vulnerable spot, became frantic all at once. "Shut up. My matters with her are none of your business. Also, Cindy is allergic to cat hair. The cat is yours. Take it with you." His cold and merciless tone was more chilling than the snow in the dead of winter. Sue paused for a moment, then pulled her lips into a mocking smile, tears still in her eyes. "Jimmy, it's just you and me now. Cindy is dead. Who are you putting on this act for? If you loved her so much, why were you still entangled with me? Cindy's allergic to cats, and you're only aware of that now. Don't be in denial. You enjoyed watching her suffer for your sake, didn't you? You were thrilled to see her enduring pain for you. What do you think our love was based on? You're selfish, hypocritical, and love placing blame on others. We're the same. Jimmy looked like a liar whose cover had been blown, his face red with anger. He put down the urn, rushed to Sue, and slapped her hard, knocking her to the ground. Sue laughed hysterically, and amidst Jimmy's incoherent yelling, she stumbled out. I floated in mid-air, silently watching Jimmy finally calm down, cleaning the house spotlessly and removing every hair. Then, he placed the urn in the most prominent location. He muttered to himself, repeatedly, "The things you don't like, they will never appear again. But, why bother now? I'm already dead. I won't ever appear again." Soon after, news came from the station that the culprit was caught. Simon's capture happened much faster than I expected. Master gathered all the police forces, and after days of non-stop searching, arrested Simon on his way to escape the province. In the interrogation room, he confessed to his crime, but deliberately omitted Sue's involvement. Yet, Master, with his extensive experience, saw through Simon's lies with just a few probing questions. Jimmy rushed into the observation room, and, through the one-way mirror, saw Simon sitting in the interrogation chair, recounting the crime. His chest heaved violently, and he pounded on the glass. 7 years ago, you killed my father, and now, you murdered my fiancé. Coincidentally, Master was also asking this question. After being caught, Simon lost his sanity. He raved madly. "Stupid bitch. She's been chasing me for 7 years. If she hadn't pushed me to the brink, would I have gone this far? She never understood why she could never catch me whenever she was close, did she?" asked Jimmy. He knows best. Cindy's whereabouts were always told to us by Sue. The interrogation room fell silent, with shock evident on everyone's faces, Jimmy included. But he didn't stay stunned for long. He frantically tried to storm in to confront Simon, but stopped abruptly at the door, collapsing to his knees, his expression turning incredibly pained, as if remembering something. Sue asked about Cindy's whereabouts out of concern, only to pry information from me. I trembled all over, staring at him intensely. How ridiculous. The wish I worked so hard to fulfill for him, in the end, the biggest obstacle was him. How foolish was I to give my all for such a man, only to lose my life. Uncontrollable hatred surged through me, the resentment and agony before death, the betrayal and abandonment I suffered, all crashed over me like a stormy sea. I almost drowned in this disaster again. Jimmy leaned against the wall, slowly sliding to the floor. He slapped himself on the face repeatedly and furiously until his face was red and swollen with clear handprints. I smirked as I watched everything in front of me, the hatred in my heart not diminished one bit. Not enough, not nearly enough. If Simon was the murderer who killed me, then Jimmy was his accomplice. He looked full of regret and despair now. Who was he trying to fool? Late feelings are worthless. I didn't need them. I wished I could kill him with my own hands, making him feel the pain I endured before I died. Master walked out of the interrogation room and forcefully pushed open the observation room door. A semi-retired old man in his 50s or 60s, eyes red with anger, he yanked Jimmy off the floor and punched him hard twice. None of the colleagues standing around tried to stop him. Jimmy's eyes were empty, his body stiff like deadwood. He didn't resist or move, taking the beatings and insults as if he had lost all hope, lying there like an empty shell. Master glared with eyes cold as ice, looking at Jimmy as if he were a dead man. "The girl is dead already. Who are you pretending for now? I could tell from the start you two weren't a good match when she first joined the force, but she was dead set on you. Jimmy, did you think Cindy couldn't get married and had to stick to you? Truth is, you weren't good enough for her. She was so young, to lose her life for a scumbag like you. If you have any conscience, you should live the rest of your life in repentance." Jimmy covered his face with his hands, hot tears streaming down through his palms. He bit his lip hard to keep from making any sound until blood mixed with tears fell to the floor. The light shone down on his messy hair, making him look utterly defeated, no longer the cold and noble figure he once was. After that day, information on Simon, the suspect caught after 7 years, was released online. Families victimized back then took to the courts demanding heavy punishment. Knowing a female cop was killed by Simon and his daughter during the arrest sparked public outrage. Many media outlets following the case dug up information about Sue. Netizens claiming to be classmates of hers exposed more dirt. When Sue's family learned they'd have to pay compensation for the fatal accident, the first thing they did was transfer their assets and send their daughter abroad to enjoy life. After returning, she got entangled with her ex-boyfriend again, detailed by netizens, dissecting our relationship with vivid accuracy. It instantly sparked nationwide anger. The scumbag and the wretched woman should both rot in jail. This guy is disgusting, still hooking up with his ex after his dad was killed. His moral compass is worse than a dog's. I hope this policewoman finds better people and a better life in her next one. The long-standing case finally cracked after 7 years. Sue was handed a severe sentence for her crimes of harboring and aiding. Simon, responsible for 4 lives and causing serious social harm, was sentenced to death. My funeral was organized by my fellow officers. It was held in a cemetery, with a wide open view. After several days of gloomy weather, the sun finally came out. White clouds floated in clusters in the sky. The high ground of the cemetery made the clouds seem close enough to touch. Master placed a bunch of kapok flowers on my tombstone, brushing off the dust. His voice choked, but pretending to be light-hearted. "Silly girl, you promised to take good care of me. How could you leave before me? I'm at retirement age. Wasn't planning on taking any more apprentices, but you insisted. Originally, I thought you'd be the one offering incense for me during Tomb Sweeping Festival, but now look." Master stood still, and from behind him, I could see his back suddenly slumping, his shoulders trembling violently. My tears fell uncontrollably as I looked at my former comrades, crying my heart out. After the funeral, I stayed in the cemetery, lying on the grass watching the clouds. My form was already becoming faint, thin like a layer of invisible gauze, as if I could be blown away at any moment. There wasn't much time left in the world for me. I looked at my black and white photo on the tombstone, my lips lifting for once. Even though I joined the force for Jimmy, every day here had been truly happy. The photo was my ID picture from when I first joined the force. Back then, I had an honest smile, full of life. I had bright dreams for my career, hopeful for love, living passionately despite the imperfections in my life. I immersed myself in past memories, recalling the carefree times that were rare in my life. Someone had to show up and ruin it. Cindy. Jimmy stood in front of my tombstone, placing a bunch of white chrysanthemums. He looked terribly thin, filled with a sense of deathly gloom. In just a few days, he seemed like a different person. His eyes were hollow, cheeks sunken, clearly not having eaten well. He squatted by my tombstone, rambling on about many things. From when we first met, to supporting each other, striving forward together, recalling everything clearly. Even memories I had blurred, he remembered in detail. The first year we met, we were about 15 or 16. You had a ponytail, speaking and acting like a little grown-up, living boldly, like a little son. I knew about your family situation back then. Never thought such a family could raise someone as lively as you. Cindy, actually before you even noticed me, my eyes were already drawn to you, but Jimmy, looking despondent, lowered his eyes, gently tracing my photo with his fingers, carefully and slowly, like he didn't want to disturb me. Your parents were right. I was bad luck. If not for being with me, you'd have had a better life. His tone was calm, but I could hear the absolute self-loathing and hopelessness. As night fell, the sky filled with stars, the man by the tombstone finally moved. His face was pale, lips cracked, hand clutching his stomach in pain. I knew he was having a stomach ulcer attack. I watched him quietly, feeling nothing inside. If he wants to harm his body, it's not my business. Jimmy shifted his body and stood up. His eyes were lifeless. Cindy, life without you is too hard. I was stunned. Suddenly, I understood what he was planning to do. Sure enough, I followed him to that stretch of sea. Under the moonlight, the water was so still you couldn't hear a thing. It was as calm as a mirror, like a heavenly looking glass. Jimmy stood at the shore, staring quietly at the water beneath his feet. His voice was hoarse, like it was slipping out of his throat. If I jump from here, will I see you again? I chuckled. No, you won't. I used to follow him everywhere. Anytime he wanted to see me, I'd drop everything to appear before him. But now I'm tired. I don't want him anymore. The world is so big. Where would he find me now? Wendy, I don't know when, floated to my side. You're still here. I thought you moved on. Jimmy was wading through the water, shouting my name. Too noisy. I really didn't want to see him. Wendy raised a wave and pushed him back to the shore. He got up and stared blankly at the moon on the horizon, mumbling. Cindy, is that you? Are you saving me? How could I let you die alone? When the sea is so cold, so strong, so salty, let me stay with you. In the next life, I'll accommodate you. He walked back into the water. The sea rose from his ankles to his chest. He closed his eyes and leaned back. I told Wendy, living together was already a regret. Let's not share a grave after death. The waves pushed him back to the shore again. He finally collapsed to his knees. Taking out a scalpel, he trembled as he pierced his own heart. Wendy tried to comfort me. Next life, he will make it up to you. I shook my head. Why would I need his apologies? Can the suffering of this life be repaid in the next? I never want to see him again. Really? Well, I've been stuck by this sea for too long. The water surged and swallowed him. Wendy dragged him to the bottom of the sea. His soul couldn't find peace, forever waiting for the next stand-in. And I finally moved toward my next new world. On the way to my reincarnation, Wendy, newly freed, asked me what I wanted to be in the next life. I said, I want to be the spring breeze, romantic and free, to see the sights I missed in this life, pass through forests, wade through clear streams, climb mountains high, rushing toward the future with no limits.